The History Hour podcast is made possible with our partner WUPI 92.1 FM The Owl, Umpy and Presque Isle's #1 hit music station.
Welcome to the show, history buffs and friends of history, and hello to you from whatever place you're listening to us today. This is Evan, Kris, Bethany, and Kaleb, your hosts, and we're all members of the Umpy History Club here at the University of Maine, Presque Isle, and we are broadcasting from the WUPI 92.1 FM in Presque Isle. On this episode of our podcast series, we will be discovering and learning about the one and only lynching in New England, the story of Jim Cullen. Our special guest for this episode is a familiar face here at the History Hour, and that is Kim Smith from the Presque Isle Historical Society, that because of her knowledge in many topics in history, she's always available for us, even in a short notice. Welcome to our show, Kim, and can you tell us a little bit about what are you up to these days, and any Historical Society events our listeners and followers should know?
Oh my goodness. I don't know where to start with that one. Good evening or good afternoon or whenever this airs. Hello, everyone. Yeah, we have so much going on right now. We have 2 brand new tours. The Jim Cullen Tour, which takes place once a month on a Saturday. And we also have the Haunted Hearse Tours.
Ooh, that's nice.
Those are very exciting. It's all about the Maine Paranormal Investigation team who came up and looked at some of our properties to see where there might be lingering spirits roaming around. And they brought all kinds of scientific equipment with them. It was fascinating to watch. And I asked if I could use everything they brought, and they let me. So that was really interesting. So we love to take people on those tours. But the Jim Cullen Tour, of course, that's why we're here. That is kind of a new look at some old historical facts, and some new things have come to light, making it a little more interesting, perhaps. We actually take people to the sites of where he lived, where he committed his crimes, where he was lynched, where he was buried, where he was put on display after he was dead.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get a cover from like the beginning of the story, like
you get
all
the
the spots.
Whole shebang. Yeah.
I swear this entire town is haunted.
Well, you know, the Maine Paranormal team, when they came up, they said they didn't know what to expect because they hadn't been this far north before. And typically they only go to one location and spend the whole weekend there. They were here for 2 weekends. I took them to about 15 or 16 sites, and they were kind of amazed. And of course, in October, we have the Haunted Lantern Tours.
Yep. We'll be there, right, Kris? Bethany, Kaleb?
That we will.
Yeah. So, today, everyone that is listening to us, get your ropes and rocks ready, because we are talking about lynching in New England. Although lynching is well-known in the southern states, and that goes back to slavery and mobs taking the law in their hands, did you guys know that officially there was only one lynching in the whole of New England?
Really?
And yeah, that was right here in Aroostook County. And the most important part is right here in the Presque Isle region.
Right.
So a question that I always get, and we should answer that, or maybe we'll think about it and we will answer it in the end, is should we feel feel proud of that historical event or not? We'll answer at the end, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone should be proud of a lynching, but you can't change history. It happened here. It's unique. It's unusual. So it's something that people should perhaps know about.
At least it wasn't about race.
And it's such a cool story too.
And that is very true, which makes it even more unique. And so, I mean, the death penalty in Maine came in 1823. We became a state in 1820, so it didn't take long for the death penalty to show up. But it's like they couldn't make up their mind because they abolished it in 1876. They reinstated it in 1883. They abolished it again in 1887. And the whole reasons why you could use the death penalty also changed. Treason, murder, arson, rape, burglary, and robbery were the primary reasons. And when the death penalty was first introduced, hanging was a legal means. But it's important to differentiate the fact that hanging is different from lynching.
Yeah, and Kris was actually asking about it, like, what's the definition of that?
And I can tell you that. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
So, lynching by definition is to put to death, especially by hanging, by mob action without legal authority. So that is key to keep in mind when you're discussing the fact that Jim Cullen was lynched.
Yep. Because it was the mob involved. That
There
was the beginning of the story.
mob involvement, yes.
And hanging is just like by the law, them hanging, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. But even so, no matter how you look at it, that whole era, think of some of the old Westerns you may have seen. And have you ever watched a Western where the bad guy was hung and they're outside and they're building the gallows and you have the people gathering and they're bringing their kids and they got picnic lunches? So the whole mindset about that was completely different. Can you imagine that happening today?
Yeah.
Not in the slightest. I find it fascinating that over time we went from a society of yay, death, to realizing let's not do that.
Well, the Victorians, and this was during the Victorian era, they were fascinated by death anyway. I mean, they just had different philosophies on things and different ways of thinking about these than we do. And so it's hard to put, our concepts and our beliefs into what they were thinking.
Well, yeah, today you can't even joke about death without someone being offended by it anyway, so.
Yeah. So you're going to give a definition of lynching, and I have another definition that, again, states exactly the same thing, that it's mobs capturing individuals as suspected of crime and take them from the office of law. And so they're practicing their own law under their own set of consciousness, of ideals, or whatever their means are.
Right.
So, okay, we got the first part, which is define what are we going to talk about. So now let's begin with the story of Jim Cullen and the famous only lynching in New England.
Well, you have to kind of understand Jim and his background first.
Absolutely.
And he was raised in a family with 16 children. Very poor farmers. He was from Canada, because we don't want to claim him. I'm just saying. And, sorry about that, our friends in Canada. He tried farming, didn't do very well at it. And this was a time in Maine when timber was huge and it was a big commodity. There was a lot of work in the lumber industry. Shingle mills were kind of where it was at. Mapleton was originally known as Ball's Mills, and they had a large shingle mill there. So he would come over here when he wasn't farming to work in the lumber trade and to work in the shingle mills. And that's kind of what brought him to this area. He had a friend that he met in, and I'm going to use the term friend very loosely, and you'll understand why in a moment. He had a friend that he had met in Canada, and the friend was over in this area. So when he came over this way to work, he decided he would stop and visit his friend. And the friend had fairly recently married. The friend's last name was Twist, and he had a young bride, and I do mean a young bride. She was 16 when they got married. She was now 17, already had a child. And when Jim came, there was kind of an instant attraction there. And she made it very well known that she wasn't happy with Mr. Twist and would be very happy to leave with Jim when he left. And to me, that kind of sets the tone, because this is a recurring theme with her, and you'll see that throughout this story. So indeed, when he left, he took her with him. And as I was doing some genealogy research to back all this up, what I found of interest was I found a marriage certificate for Jim and Rosella, but I never found a divorce certificate for Rosella and Mr. Twist.
Spicy.
That's because, and I think, didn't he?
Drama.
Yeah, and that fact that you just found, I think it backs the story that because Rosella left and she had a kid actually at that time.
They had a child together, yes.
So she went to New Brunswick with Jim. Her husband, Mr. Twist, I think you said.
Mr. Twist.
He moved to Southern Maine with his family.
He did. He was so heartbroken
Yeah.
about all of this that he left the area.
So they were actually not divorced, actually, right?
Well, I'm not saying they weren't. I'm saying I could find no proof.
Okay, that makes the story more.
It does.
More
and
interesting,
again,
yeah.
you're starting to see, things here that may not have really been delved into before. So she and Jim are now together. She finds herself in the family way, and they get married. They move over here because he's working over here in the shingle mill, and her family was originally from over here, so she wanted to be closer to her mother. The lumber industry not doing quite as well. Jim not really able to provide for the family, at least in the manner that she wanted to be provided for.
A woman of class.
Well, I won't go that far.
A Victorian.
Class.
A woman who wanted a lot, we'll say that. And so he started committing perhaps some petty crimes. As he was working for people doing side jobs, he would take a little side trip into their root cellar, maybe lift a couple cans of food, because he had a family now to provide for. And by the way, their child was deaf. He was born deaf. And Rosella held this against him. He had, that was a genetic track
In Jim's family, yeah.
in his family. There was at least one, if not two, of his siblings that were deaf. And so she held this against him. And I just find this so sad. The child's name was James, but they called him Dummy.
Yeah, that was his name, yeah.
Of course, he couldn't hear them.
And I mean, how could you expect that from the mother, right? Like, she held it against... I think it shows a lot about her character.
You're learning about her just by virtue of these facts, right? And time goes on. He's not doing really well financially. She's not happy because he's not providing for her in the manner that she wants to be provided for. In the meantime, the house that they are living in is purchased by a man who has moved to the area. He's a young man, but he's making something of himself, and he's making a good living. He has a reputation in the area. He's about to become a Mason, so people think well of him. His name was Thomas Hubbard.
Yeah.
And Jim starts to hear rumors that there's something going on between them. So he comes back to his house to confront them, catches them holding hands, and I don't know why anyone would get in Jim's face. The man was 6'4", 240 pounds,
yeah. He's a big man.
Yeah. And so Thomas Hubbard says, "You're no longer welcome in this house. Rosella and I want to be together."
In history, the dumbest mistakes are going with people who can throw you through a wall.
Yeah,
And-
I just really, why would you do that? So he goes out and goes to the stable and proceeds to slit the throat of Thomas Hubbard's prize stallion,
His favorite horse, yeah.
his favorite horse, right. Then he goes in the middle of the night, virtually, to David Dudley's store out in the Mapleton Castle Hill area,
Mhm.
robs the store. Everybody knows the story of the boots. And this is where the boots come in. So David Dudley had a pair of boots on display in the store. They were very large size boots. Jim had very large feet. And he hoped that Jim would buy the boots. When they come the next morning to open the store, the boots are gone. And the way the folktale goes is there were footprints through the snow, because this was April in Maine, we still have snow, leading back to where Jim lives. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but this is the folktale. So,
But I think he also another part of the story says that he forgot his old boots in the store, so that was another he gave himself up in a way, because he left his
calling
old
card.
boots, and then he got some cash and the new
yes,
boots, and
yeah,
he
they
robbed
say
the
the
store.
actual value of what he took was about $25.
Yeah, it
of course,
was-
in today's money, that's a lot more,
Totally, yeah.
but he took more than just the boots.
Mhm.
And
If he left his books, his old boots back, then I think they can trace him back.
but ends up running. And he runs out into the woods to a camp in the Chapman area that was owned by a German immigrant that people call Swanbeck. His name wasn't actually Swanbeck, but that's what they called him. Very close, but it had a slight spelling differentiation. And because the snow was on the ground, the sheriff's deputy, it wasn't the sheriff himself, the sheriff's deputy had to wait until he got snowshoes and such to go out after him. Now, the sheriff is an older man. His last name is Kalloch, Kalloch. It happens to be Augusta Christie's grandfather. Augusta Christie was involved in the forming of Northern Maine Community College. And his deputy said, you're too elderly. This isn't for old people. You stay here. We'll go do this. And the main deputy was Granville Hayden, who was a young husband and father. He deputizes Thomas Hubbard, and they go out after Cullen.
Mm-hmm.
So and they do find him. When they do, Granville Hayden has a little private conversation with Jim. And everyone, when you first glance through, they stay in the camp overnight because it's late. They don't want to truck back through the snow to get back to town. They don't restrain Jim.
Because he
Best
hoped
idea.
he will escape.
He hoped
Yeah.
that he would escape. And that's kind of what it's thought the conversation was. We're not going to restrain you. Why don't you get up in the middle of the night, go back home to Canada, then it won't be our problem anymore.
I mean, nobody wanted Jim in their communities. Everybody wanted him to leave. So they're like, even if they catch you, like, we don't want you here. So you better go home, You better cross the border and go back.
Well, and that's a thought that supposedly crossed his mind, but there's also some talk that he wasn't really welcome back in New Brunswick either.
I mean, he
And-
sold all his property when he moved here, so there wasn't really much for him.
His family was still there.
His family, yeah, but his own
His lot, yeah.
his land was sold, so.
Right. And as the story reads, he does get up in the middle of the night. He goes outside and he's considering his options of leaving. But he starts getting angry and he feels that he has been mistreated. And in a way, he really had, because he'd been wronged by the woman that, he thought loved him.
And also by his friend that bought his house,
But if you think about it, he wronged his friend before that by taking his
I was going
wife.
to say,
right?
That is true.
The moral of
Yes.
the story is don't be friends with anyone.
Don't be friends with Jim Cullen.
yeah.
Karma sucks.
Yeah.
And so he gets angry and he works himself into a frenzy. He takes a broadaxe. He goes back into the camp. And there are other men in the camp besides the two sheriffs. There's Jim Swanbeck is there.
Oh, yes,
And
yeah.
another young man by the name of Minot Bird is there. And both of them woke up during the process of the killing by the axe. And they leave. They run literally out into the woods in their stocking feet and take off towards the next camps.
Yep.
Jim murders the 2 deputy sheriffs, sets their bodies on fire. It ends up burning down the camp, and off he goes. So he goes back home because he does take the money that the deputy sheriffs have. He goes back home, and there's also some thought that maybe he was going back to kill her.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. But he gives her the money, and by this time, a warrant has been sworn out for his arrest because word has traveled. It's been overnight. Of course, we didn't have cars back then, so it did take a while for things to travel back to town.
Yeah.
And posses start being formed. More than one. They had 3 different posses coming from 3 different directions after him. One finally goes to the house, and they say to Rosella, "Is Jim here?" And she says loudly, "No, he's not." But the whole time she's pointing at the floor.
Where he was hidden.
He was hiding in the basement.
She's making sure that he doesn't come out and kill her as well.
She's such a great lady.
I think she just wants to get rid of him so she can move on with her life. She's done with him in her mind.
And
While
she,
still protecting her own skin.
and she got the
Exactly.
sheriff's money without saying anything. She pocketed that, and then she gave Jim up
Right? So, I mean, we're seeing a theme with her, right?
twice,
And, yeah.
maybe 3 times.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It doesn't end. And they arrest Jim. They take him down to the store, and he's sitting in the store waiting for the wagon to come get him. And
To bring him to Presque Isle.
right.
Yeah.
Several people start arriving because Tom Hubbard was well respected. Granville Hayden was well respected. He was a Mason as well. You have people coming, and they're basically getting in Jim's face. And Jim readily admitted that he did this. And his 2 regrets that he admitted to was basically that he didn't kill the other 2 guys out there because that's how they found out about him. And then supposedly one of his other regrets is that he didn't kill his wife and child as well.
Yep. He didn't feel ashamed about anything he did.
Great story.
I know.
Great story.
And they eventually get there. The other people that spoke to him were very angry, and they made it very well known that they were angry. And some of the other players in this whole story are also well known in Presque Isle history. You have Presque Isle's pirate. Sidney Cook is involved in this whole story. The rumor is that the noose had mariner's knots tied in it, so they think that perhaps Sidney Cook is the one that tied the noose. You have to remember that this whole lynching was kind of secret. The men were trying to protect their identities. Some people think that perhaps a lot of them were Masons. Masons are supposed to be...
Watch each other's backs, avenge each other.
Well, they're supposed to be, upstanding businessmen, and so they don't want it known that they're doing this kind of thing. And so he eventually gets put on the wagon, and they have him handcuffed, and they have him shackled to the wagon. Now, one of the really interesting artifacts that we happen to have in our collection are the actual handcuffs. They are Darby handcuffs. I don't know how familiar you are with the design of handcuffs, but Darby handcuffs are rigid. They're not like today's handcuffs that are adjustable for the size of someone's wrist. So imagine how large the wrists of a man that size were.
Enormous.
Pretty big, yeah.
Like
Right?
one of my calves.
Right. I mean, this, and he would boast of his strength. He was a very strong man, so his wrists had to be quite large. And those handcuffs are so small.
Yes, they are. I saw them, so.
They are so small, and you have to wonder how they went around his wrists.
His tendon snapped.
Well, they say that, and it's very possible that his wrists were broken because the handcuffs were so small. As he's coming back into town, a group of men, allegedly wearing hoods so no one would know who they were, comes upon the deputy sheriff bringing him back to town. They forcibly take Jim Cullen out of the wagon. Now, the deputy sheriff, doing his job, tries to stop them. They sit on him
So he can move, yeah.
so he can't move.
I don't
they
mean
sit
to laugh,
on him.
but that's not pathetic per se, but one of the best ways to get rid of a deputy sheriff. We won't hurt you. We're just going to sit on you while we take your prisoner.
Right. Right? They're not holding a weapon on him. They're not hurting him. They're just sitting on him. And they pull Jim off the wagon so forcibly that some of the wood comes off with his leg shackles. Wow. They even wonder if the force of pulling him off actually snapped his neck and that perhaps he was even dead before they hung him.
Which is possible after that, yeah.
And it's interesting that they happen to have a doctor with them. The doctor happened to be a Mason.
Naturally.
Of course.
And the doctor made sure that he was truly dead before they took him down from the tree. And they were on their way to bring him back to Presque Isle to put him in jail so he could go to court and have his day in court. The mob didn't think he was going to get the justice that they felt he deserved. So, interestingly enough, they do end up bringing his body back to Presque Isle. And again, if you remember watching Westerns, remember seeing like people in pine boxes standing up for people to look at them? Yeah. This is what they did. So they bring Jim Cullen back. They put him in a pine box. They stand it up on the street, and people go by and look at him for a couple of days.
Almost like an oddity.
It was.
Well, he was very hated too, so I think that was kind of
horribly hated.
They were so relieved that he was dead.
And women would go by with their hat pins and stab the body.
Yeah.
It was traditional. They were long. Yeah, they were long. And it was also traditional for bodies to be wrapped in a shroud before they were buried. The local women would make the shrouds for the deceased. No one would make him a shroud. He's on display for about 3 days, and they said, well, okay, he's getting a little ripe. Let's plant him, right? They're getting ready to take him to the local cemetery. And again, the good people step forward and say,
Yeah, no.
Absolutely not. You are not putting that man in our beautiful cemetery.
Don't they take him to like a gravel pit and just bury him unmarked?
They did. They buried him at the edge of the gravel pit in an unmarked grave. And you would think the story would end there.
Well, before you continue, I'm going to take a break. And I'd like to thank WUPI 92.1 FM for hosting our podcast. And we wanted to let you know that WUPI is now available online, but also on the TuneIn app. So make sure you click that subscribe button and listen to Umpi's and Presque Isle's #1 hit music station. If you want to keep up with WUPI's and Umpi's events and news, make sure you like their page on Facebook and Instagram. And also, if you want to find more about our podcast series and to listen to our previous podcasts, make sure to follow our podcast on SoundCloud and YouTube by simply searching History Hour Podcast, and make sure to throw some likes at us. Now back to the story, and I think we stopped right at the right moment, right?
We did. It was the perfect place to
where
stop.
Things
actually
get more interested, right?
And there's
somehow more interesting.
Yeah.
There's actually a couple more pieces to this story, but this part is kind of
Spoopy.
Yeah.
So we didn't give a time frame though when we begin. So just for our for everybody that listens to us, that happened in the 1870s, right?
1873. He
Yeah.
committed the crimes on April 26th of 1873, and that's kind of key to know to hear the rest of the story.
All right.
So we're going to jump forward a few months, then we'll jump back again. So we're going to jump forward now. He's buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the gravel pit. And nothing happens in a vacuum. So life goes on, other things are happening. And one of the trends that was very active at the time is the belief in phrenology. I don't know if you know what phrenology is. Phrenology at the time was thought to be a science. We know now that it's not. It's not really based on real science.
Anything.
Phrenology was the study of bumps on your head, essentially.
Oh,
Where
I
people
read
would
about those,
put
yeah.
their palms on your head and they would feel around for the bumps and the indentations, and they felt that they could tell what your characteristics and traits were based on where there were bumps or where there weren't.
If you've read Alias Grace, by Margaret Atwood, she talks a lot about this, and it was like really popular. They would go into the old like Victorian era prisons, especially I know in Canada. I bet they did it in America too, but they would like test people's heads to like see if they could see by the bumps on their heads if it was like if they had like certain characteristics and traits, then they could stop them when they were real young and like imprison them and put them in like mental institutions.
That's 1800s for you.
That is very, very true. Phrenology was huge in Europe and in the United States. It was huge here, especially two different times during the Civil War and earlier as well, in like the 1820s as well. And at this time in Maine, if you look at the local newspapers, you will find advertisements for phrenology lectures taking place all over the area. There was one particular gentleman who claimed to be a professor in phrenology, a graduate of the Fowler Institute of Phrenology in New York City. And he made regular trips to northern Maine. He was from the Lewiston, Auburn area, made regular trips to northern Maine to lecture on phrenology. And lo and behold, he comes to northern Maine around September of that year. So we're now 5 months out, right? Mm-hmm. And he hears this whole story about Jim Cullen. Now,
Perfect evidence.
He's so excited, probably.
back this up. One of the offshoots of phrenology worldwide is that people are robbing graves.
That is just insane.
Geronimo, Mozart, Thomas Paine, I mean, the list goes on. Famous people and famous criminals. Infamous, perhaps.
You know, science.
Right. Weird science. Weird science. So people are robbing graves to get these skulls so they can prove their theory, right? So this gentleman by the name of Luther Bateman comes to town, hears the story of Jim Cullen, and says, I have to have his head. So,
Most logical sentence.
right.
Perfect
Right?
statement.
So he tries to find someone to tell him where Cullen is buried. No one wants to tell him.
Really? I'm shocked.
Uh-huh. Well, almost no one. He comes across a young attorney by the name of George Smith who was kind of down on his luck, and he offers him $25 to show him where the grave is. And Smith, no relation, by the way. Smith says, well, I will, but we have to do this in the dead of night so no one sees me taking you to the grave. So off they go. They get there, and Bateman says to Smith, okay, help me dig him up. What?
This is not in the agreement. I will need an extra $15.
Right?
Not in the terms and conditions.
So Bateman does, of course, the most logical thing. He gets him drunk.
Oh,
Why not?
Nailed it.
Right? So he helps him dig him up. Now it's only been 5 months.
Oh no.
so it's real stinky.
5 months from when he was buried.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's
And,
a lot.
Not embalmed like they are today, right? 5 months. And he says, okay, help me take the head off.
Oh, no.
That's
Yeah,
what
Poor
we're here.
guy.
Not
What?
the deal.
So, again, Bateman does the logical thing. Gives him some more booze. They dig him up, and he says, okay, now I need to boil the head so I can take the skin and hair off.
Go bring me some pots, boy, you know?
It's like, all right, we're gonna need a whole
Some
bottle
water.
of scotch for this. Just go grab that.
So-
I need a whole winery, please.
So they do. Well, they were
Wow.
drinking gin, I think.
Oh.
Gin or, yeah,
Yeah.
whiskey or something. So they do. They take the head off. They boil it. They rebury the skin and hair.
From the head?
No.
Oh boy.
Really? Really?
And off Mr. Bateman goes with the skull.
Wow.
And Mr. Smith is scarred for life.
He's drinking
Mr.
moonshine for the rest
Mr.
of
Smith
his days.
ends up becoming a judge in Presque Isle.
Of course.
That's too
course.
good.
So did they bury that though at the same exact spot, or was it like a different? Or we don't
Yeah,
know.
I can't answer that.
We don't know.
I don't know.
A hole somewhere.
He
Right.
looks like a man that's seen
So-
some things.
Right? And
This won't translate well. but
time
you saw
goes
his picture.
by,
Yeah.
and our Mr. Smith goes to a carnival and sideshows, very big in those days. Phrenologists would often go to these carnivals and sideshows to talk about, their
'Cause their
phrenology.
career is a sideshow.
And Mr. Smith runs into, guess who? Mr. Bateman. And he says, hey, wait a minute, I know you. And Mr. Bateman kind of freaks out. He grabs all of his skulls and off he goes. So by now, phrenology is debunked. It's not a science. We know this. And Mr. Bateman goes into a different line of business. He becomes a very well-respected journalist down in the Lewiston area.
Oh my gosh, Lewis.
However, it's said that he kept that skull in a glass case on his desk.
Oh.
I mean, that's
He's a stern believer
That
in
was
something
that's
that
a
doesn't
well
exist.
that's a well good find,
It was
Yeah.
his favorite skull.
It's his favorite.
Labeled
skull.
it
You never
in
know.
gold.
And so we don't know where it is today. We would like to know where it is today, but we don't know.
So it wasn't found in his house or anything? It was just... It wasn't found in his house or anything? It was just gone?
Don't know.
Ah.
It might be, he might have like a secret university room that he's somewhere.
So I'm going to go back in time now. I'm going back closer to the event. So the event took place around April 26th. On May 1st,
If you say anything about May 13th, I'm gonna be annoyed. My birthday.
it's May Day too. On May 1st, I'm looking for a piece of paper. I'm just not finding it. There is a newspaper here in town called the North Star, and it's run by a man by the name of Daniel Stickney. Well, Mr. Stickney is appalled by the behavior of the mob, and he puts out a special edition of his newspaper, the North Star Extra, which comes out on May 1st, right? And he pretty much blasts anyone who took part in this.
Really?
And it says, a terrible tragedy, 2 men murdered, and then later the murderer hung. Those are kind of the headlines. And you can see, it's a big, long article.
Yeah, it's
And the gentlemen who were involved came to him, and they said, you go out and you collect every single piece of that paper, because if you don't, we're coming after you and your family.
Whoa.
Okay.
after all, this is Aroostook County
Right.
Yeah.
in the 1800s.
And it's interesting to me because I hadn't known about this piece before when I was doing my research, but I did know that years later in 1880 something, Stickney was run out of town. And he was run out of town supposedly because he made the people forming the fire department angry. He kept saying, you're not being proactive enough in fighting fires. You have to remember we were founded in 1828, but didn't have a fire department until 1896. And he kept saying, oh, we're going to have a big fire. Everything's going to burn down. And then it happened.
Lumbertown.
And then it happened, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, he's run out of town. And now that I know this part kind of makes sense because they were really angry with him, right? So that's part of it. But it didn't stop. Articles were published about this right up into the mid-1900s. Here's one, something definite about Cullen's head. And this one is from 1930. And
in the 1800s, that was probably like the big event that happened up here. It was like so shocking and so important, I think.
yes.
Mr. Roos, like nothing happened. This was groundbreaking.
And then here's another one, a souvenir of the Cullen incident. And they actually kept souvenirs. They went out and they cut down the limb and divided up the pieces for people to keep parts of it.
And
The
the
limb of the
rope
tree.
and
They
stuff.
kept
and
parts of the rope.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. And then another one, this is a reminiscence by Mr. Kaleb, who was the sheriff. So there are lots of really interesting articles on this whole thing. And it's interesting one of these articles talks about George Smith, the attorney, and the person doing the talking is his brother Fred, and this is kind of a related but not related story. So really recently, like within the last couple of months, someone called on the phone and said, I have some things I want to donate. And she told me what they were. And I said, yes, we'd love to have those. We'd be interested in those. And she brings them down. And she says, oh, by the way, I found this old box and I brought this too. I thought you might be interested in it. I said, okay. So I look at the box and I can tell by looking at it, it's about, a couple feet by a couple feet. And that looks really old. It's dovetailed. There's no nails in it. It looks old. And I open it up and there's a notation in it that it was a powder box during the Civil War, where powder was transferred from the caisson to the cannon. So this in and of itself makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm going to put it in our Civil War exhibit. And it has a tray in it. I pick up the tray and I look underneath, and it was owned by George Smith.
Really?
That's awesome.
Is that fascinating?
Totally, yeah.
And we also have in our collection a letter, 10-page handwritten letter, written by a woman from Mapleton on May 5th of that year to her brother who lived downstate, who was a reverend. And she starts the letter, in your usual, hi, how are you kind of way. And she only gets about 2 sentences in, and she starts, we have been having a succession of such horrid, startling affairs here lately that I don't hardly know where to begin.
She's like, listen, brother, I gotta spill the tea.
Exactly. and she
Murder.
goes into detail and tells them the whole story. And it's like, they don't know anything about the area. She's telling them this is Ball's Mills. David Dudley owns the mills and the store. And Presque Isle is the largest town near us. And she's going on. And she's talking about Jim Cullen, the thief, and how Mr. Dudley, the store owner, was involved in Swanback's camp. I mean, she just goes on. And this is really where I got some of the information that I didn't know about previously, because before Swanback and Bird started, Cullen said he wished his little child was dead. The details in this letter, because it's of the time, and this is essentially like a primary source, this is stuff that we didn't necessarily know.
Now, when did you find this article?
This was donated to us in the last couple of years.
So before then, nobody knew of the existence of this, right?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, so that adds a lot to the story.
It really does.
It is a primary source.
It is, and it's fascinating. She talks about Swanback was awakened by hearing the blows and saw Cullen strike Hayden and Hubbard. Bird woke up when Swanback left the camp, and she talks about, if you can, I love this part. This is so 1800s. Imagine, if you can, the horror, surprise, indignation, fear, and all other sorts of emotion which seized our little settlement when the blunt facts were told. And
I'm sold.
This is her. This is her writing, in the letter, and it's just.
And
A lot
the
of
fact
drama
she was like
made it for this.
uninhibited because she was writing her brother, and she was just like, I'm gonna tell you everything. So it's like pretty much all, like, other than the fact that it was gossip, like, factual.
Well, and her husband was actually involved in the search.
Was he possibly a mob posse member?
It doesn't really suggest that he was part of the mob,
okay.
but it does suggest that he was part of the group that went out. Her husband's name was Richard, and he said Richard was one of those who went to the woods where the crime was committed. But as he and others had no snowshoes, they waited there long hours in the woods until the others went and came back.
Well,
So it doesn't sound like he was a Lynch person, but
She wouldn't really tell
a reverend.
Through a letter that.
Guess what
Oh
my
yeah,
husband did.
we're the one that lynched Jim Cullen. That's great.
I mean, until today, we don't know who lynched Jim Cullen.
Yeah.
Which is a
That
great
was
mystery
remains
It's
by
a real
itself.
question of who done it.
everyone back then, of course, knew. I mean,
Exactly. And there might be an
It's-
article somewhere hidden that lists the names.
it's not
You
a
never
large.
know.
It wasn't a large community back then, so
That's true,
everyone
yeah.
had to know.
It just wasn't preserved.
It wasn't
for-
written down. Just like
Yes.
they wanted to wipe Jim from our memory,
Yeah.
so we have no photos of him.
Which makes
you
sense.
know?
He killed the horse. He killed 2 men.
He burned a camp. He
He
stole
burned a-
money.
I'm sorry, this story's too amazing to forget.
Well,
But-
for us,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Very true.
Well, it is a very interesting story because don't forget this is the only instance of lynching in New England. So from New York all the way up.
Yeah.
Go Maine, I think.
So
Yeah.
go Maine. All right. So just one more kind of cool thing. So there's also a report that Rosella was asked what she thought of this whole thing, and the folktale part of it is that I'm glad he finally got his 15 minutes of fame.
Wow.
Saucy.
Yeah,
I wonder
I
where
could
she ended
believe
up.
it though.
but I can answer that question.
Oh.
I'm so glad you asked.
What was the question, Kaleb?
I wonder where she ended up. I meant more permanently, but I want to hear this.
So guess what I found afterwards? She's now a widow, if we can assume that she was really married to Cullen to begin with, since we found no divorce
Right.
certificate,
Yeah.
right? So in 1883, she marries again.
I knew it.
Was
I
it
so knew it.
Was it Thomas?
Saucy.
Was it
trumpet.
was it the
Trumpet.
guy that
What's it-
he
what did
left
he
that she left Jim for?
No, because he was murdered. He was one of the
Oh
ones
yeah,
that was
yeah,
murdered.
yeah,
A
yeah.
harlot.
And of course, yes. And of course, back then everything was spelled phonetically, so you might find the same person's name spelled, several different ways. So here it is. She marries a gentleman on the marriage certificate listed as Michael Loveway, Lovway. In other places, like the census I have here, it's Lavaway. But she did marry again. And interestingly enough, when she married for this time, she did not use the name Cullen.
Oh.
Really?
What did she use?
Goodwin.
But she was married though, because they got married here in Presque Isle.
She
Yeah.
was Rosella Twist. When she married Jim, Twist was on the marriage certificate.
So is Goodwill her
Oh.
Goodwin?
I'm not sure if Goodwin was her maiden
So she
name or
didn't
not.
take Colin at all.
Well,
Right?
But she said
apparently
she had
when
the-
when Cullen died, she must have gone back. There were Goodwins in the area, so it's possible that she
Okay.
was a Goodwin. So she marries him. Now, when you look at one of the old census records, this is a census from 1900. So we're moving forward in time. You still see her married to Mike Lavaway, but now she's going by Rose,
Oh.
not Rosella.
This
Oh.
woman and her
And
change of character.
and her son by the first marriage, Edwin Twist, is shown as living in the household, but there is no mention of James.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
I mean, my next question was, what happened to the family?
What happened to James?
We don't know, or I don't know.
Really? Wow. I mean, there's many theories. I mean, he would have probably been given out because to begin with, she didn't like him. She didn't like her
Because she was
kid.
So
because he was
sad.
deaf.
Because he was deaf.
Yeah.
Yeah. They call him dummy. So imagine that.
Yeah.
Oh my
That's really
gosh.
cool. That's really cool.
I mean, didn't they for like people like James? Didn't they put him in like mental
Foster.
institutions or
Not-
foster
I don't think
homes
they would
or?
put a deaf person in.
I mean,
I think she just
I
gave
mean,
him away
It is 1800s.
for adoption or Wow.
Or he passed away. I don't know.
probably,
Oh gosh, I really.
and we don't know
so sad.
how, by what means.
maybe it was Rose.
But so let
Don't
me
put
met
that out
some
there.
thorns.
Something's gonna happen to you, man.
I know.
so let me pose 2 questions. What do we think of Rosella as a character in this story?
Harlot, straight harlot. She was playing the fiddle of the whole thing. She's the back runner. She's the person we never suspected.
She's
mean-
not really. She kind of takes a back seat in the story, but now that you've heard some of these facts, you kind of have to hold her accountable.
Yeah.
Basically, Jim was the rubber mask, and she was the one the Scooby-Doo gang rips off.
Exactly.
She was under
I think Jim did whatever he did because of Rosella.
He obviously loved her,
Exactly.
and he was
Yeah.
upset that she ended
Yeah.
up being the type of person she was. You know, she
Right.
threw over the first husband for him. He didn't do what she wanted, so she threw him away and went for the next one she thought was going to make some money.
And after Jim, she went on again and again.
Gold
And
digger.
how do we know?
Gold
And-
digger,
yeah,
good word.
And the crazy thing is, she was only like 15.
She was 16 when she married the first time.
Mind blowing.
Wow.
Mind blowing.
Yeah.
So, what do we think of Jim?
A war-torn man at the heart.
I mean, he was the.
Bit extreme, but
He was really
Yeah.
poor.
He was poor. Obviously, there were some, criminal instincts there
He had some
because
anger
not
issues.
anyone is just going to kill someone and kill them in the manner that he did.
Right.
Now, just so you know that I'm not spouting off there, his at least one other brother also ended up being a criminal
Okay.
Of Jim's.
of Jim's.
Not to throw any negative
That's something to mull
messages
over.
to New
Yeah,
Brunswick
the
side.
parents ended up moving over here, and at least one brother, if not two, were arrested for robbery and those types of.
But still, I don't think. I mean, it could be there. You know, that trait of criminality. It could
Or
be.
could it be, because, I don't know, maybe I'm going off on a completely different limb, but like Cullen, Irish,
Mm-hmm. Very much.
then maybe could it have been like a
discrimination.
discrimination kind of thing? Because,
That too.
There,
that was
there
always
was
like the
that did
assumption,
exist.
so that
did
kind
exist
of like
then.
disposed idea of a group of people could force the people to actually become the stereotype.
If they're gonna
And
call me
maybe
evil, I
that's-
might as well be it.
Right,
mean-
exactly. That's what they had to do to survive.
I mean, Jim Cullen was already discriminated here in Presque Isle because he was from New Brunswick to begin with.
Well, there really was at that time a lot of New Brunswickers here.
Yeah.
Just some background there. At that time, there were about 1/3 of those from New Brunswick who were in Maine were working in the lumber industry. So
Yeah.
there were a lot of New Brunswickers here. And you have to remember, too, that, we're talking not too long after the Aroostook War. And if you remember, when the American Revolution ended, there was no border between Maine and Canada.
The Highlands, whatever that is.
Right.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until
Elusive.
the 1840s when there was finally a border. So for a long time,
It's very recent. Yeah.
you had people not knowing if they were Canadian or American.
Mm-hmm.
And still to this day, there's a very, very strong tie between the two.
Which I think might have touched upon Jim's character. That probably affected him a lot.
Yeah.
And also because he didn't have anything here. He didn't own any property. He was really poor. He worked many different jobs.
He didn't have much else of an option besides criminality. He had a
Exactly.
family to
And
care
I mean he has a not functioned a family with a wife that apparently doesn't like him anymore, a kid that is deaf, a kid that is not his, and also they're hungry all the time. The tensions are up. So I
The
think
wife's because he doesn't.
Exactly.
It's not bringing home right. And here's the other thing that just surprises me. Now again, there's no photos of Rosella. There's no photos of Jim. But when you look at the records, I'm picturing this, bombshell that's just tempting all these men. This siren, right?
I bet not.
Oh, so not. The write-ups say that she's a plump woman.
which to be honest, back then it was a sign of wealth.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Or it meant she was a good cook. I don't know.
That's her secret. She was cooking well.
The way to a man's heart.
I
his
don't know
stomach.
if it was cooking, but
Well, I mean,
mean,
we'll
something-
leave that to history. We'll
No,
leave that
I was
to
gonna say
history.
something, but nah. Nah.
We'll leave it to history to decide. But again, so we see again, the story is on Jim, but again, as Kim said, it is on Rosella too. A big portion of it.
It's basically the idea of Jim. Jim was the he's the Disney hero, the main character, while as he's Ariel, whereas Rosella is Ursula. They're both main characters. One of them just happens to be the main driver of the villainy.
Well,
It's just the thing is that for the story that most people know, they don't know the backstory. They
Exactly.
don't know about Rosella. They don't know how she was the one egging him on because he's not providing adequately according to her standards.
Rosella was like the puppeteer, and Jim was the puppet.
It's really true.
and also what we see the bulk of the interest is that Jim was a great criminal and that his head was stolen. I think that's where the story like everybody knows about.
Well, so what I want people to think about now is as you're driving from Presque Isle to Mapleton, especially like, this weekend, it's going to be a full moon. It's Friday the 13th. So as you're driving from Presque Isle to Mapleton and you get to the point where the airport crosses Mapleton Road, I want you to turn to your left and look to the south and think, oh, there's a headless corpse
Oh my god.
in an unmarked grave right over there.
Let's not have dreams today.
Now, and let me just tell you, since we were talking earlier about the Maine Paranormal Investigation Team,
Yeah.
my brother used to be a Presque Isle police officer. And he said, Kim, I can't tell you how often I would get phone calls of someone reporting a man walking around acting disoriented in that location.
Oh,
He said, and I would get out there and there would be nothing because there's nothing there.
Nope.
And just to put that out there, we will be having a Halloween episode in October, and Kim, you're the guest again, and we thank you for that. And we will be hopefully talking a lot about the Presque Isle ghost stories. So,
Oh yeah, I got some great ghost stories.
This whole
now.
town's possessed.
which we are very excited for.
suddenly things turned spoopy.
It's not even Halloween yet. It's not even October yet.
So going back to the story, this is the Jim Cullen episode, and what will you want to say to Jim if you saw him today? What will be one thing you will want him to know?
I am sorry for what happened to you, but I think you took things a little bit too far. Maybe, I don't know. Don't murder people, maybe? I don't know.
Get a better taste in women.
I would
That's a
like
tough
to
one.
help find his head so he could pass over and stop haunting Mapleton Road.
Kim and I are on the same
Fair point.
wavelength right now. That's exactly
How
what
about
I
you,
was
Kim?
gonna say.
Was that yours?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I will say to him, it's not 100% your fault. I think there was some other stuff.
I think I'd want him to also want him to know bros before harlots.
Okay. I mean, we can do
Sorry about that, Max.
that. Anything else that we want to add? Kim, do you have any other interesting pieces of artifacts that you want to share, or?
No, I so want to tell you the ghost stories, but that's another
After.
We
episode.
will. That's another
After.
episode.
After this, please.
And also,
I'm very excited for that. We can't wait either.
and also because this podcast will be broadcasted from WUPI on Saturday. This will be right after the tour that we can have on
On Molly the Trolley.
exactly from the Presque Isle Historical Society. Well, if nobody else has anything else to do, that's all for today's episodes of the History Hour. Thank you for listening, and a great thank you to Kim Smith for joining us today and sharing all of her thrilling stories of this topic. Join us again next week when we touch upon the turbulent times of the 70s, the Iranian hostage crisis, and the movie Argo. And make sure you tune in to WUPI 92.1 FM next Saturday at 4 p.m. so you never miss an episode. Also, for previous or future episodes of the History Hour podcast, we are now available on both SoundCloud and YouTube. So make sure you search and like our History Hour podcast pages by simply searching History Hour Podcast. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See ya.